Hi, everyone. My name is Jo Easton from the audience team at the Bangor Daily News. Thank you all for joining us this evening. For those of you here tonight who are subscribers, donors, or advertisers, thank you for your support. Thank you to our Tourmaline sponsor for this event, Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare. We also want to make a special welcome to everyone here who is coming to a BDN Issues Forum for the first time. The Bangor Daily News aims to bring Maine together through fact-based local journalism that reflects our communities and helps Mainers think through important issues in the paper in your hands, on your computer, on your phone, or through conversations in an event like we're having tonight. When you invest in your local newsroom with a subscription, you invest in your community. And finally, thank you to all of our panelists for taking the time and the care to share your perspectives about this important issue tonight. As a reminder, this event is being recorded. We received questions from many of you in advance of the event, and we will be watching the Q&A right here in Zoom for questions you raised during the hour. We'll work as many of them into the discussion as we can. BDN Opinion Editor Susan Young and Assistant Opinion Editor Matt Yunker will run the conversation tonight. I'll be in the background doing my best to keep us all on time, and Kay Stevens from our audience team will field any technical questions that arise. Susan, I'm going to hand it over to you now to start the conversation and introduce our panelists.
Thank you very much, Jo, and thank you to our audience and the panelists who have joined us tonight. Just a reminder that tonight we're talking about question 1 on the November 2nd ballot. This is a question about the New England Clean Energy Connect, a transmission line that will cross about 150 miles of Western Maine, and it will bring hydroelectric power from Quebec to Massachusetts as part of that state's clean energy plans. And we're fortunate to have representatives of both a yes on question 1 and no on question 1 with us tonight. And for the yes on 1 campaign, we have Sandi Howard, who is a volunteer with the campaign. She's a registered Maine guide and a teacher. Tonight, she's representing her role as volunteer director for the No CMP Corridor grassroots PAC. And also on the Yes on 1 campaign, we have Adam Cote, who is the head of the energy practice group at Drummond Woodsum, a Portland law firm. His practice primarily focuses on renewable energy projects, and he and his firm have represented numerous opponents to the corridor. On the no on 1 side, we have Ben Dudley, who's the director of Mainers for Clean Energy Jobs, which is a coalition of Maine businesses, labor unions, trade associations, and environmental leaders. And we have Adrienne Bennett, who is the spokesperson for Mainers for Fair Laws, which is primarily focused on the retroactive language in question 1. And we'll begin tonight with opening statements. Sandi and Adam, you're up first for the Yes on 1 campaign.
Great, and thanks to the BDM team for hosting this evening's discussion. My name is Sandi Howard, and as Susan mentioned, I'm a volunteer with the Yes on 1 campaign, so Mainers can reject the CMP corridor this November. I'm an unpaid spokesperson representing the massive multi-year grassroots effort to educate the public about the many reasons the CMP corridor is a bad deal for Maine. For the last 3 years, our volunteers have presented sworn testimony at state and federal approval agencies and at the legislature. We've collected signatures to give Mainers a chance to vote on the fate of this destructive project. And because the CMP corridor is such a bad project, it has united Mainers across the political spectrum, including state leaders and former congressional candidates. The 145-mile-long corridor would blaze a new 100-foot wide clear cut through 53.5 miles in Western Maine, which is approximately the distance from Portland to Augusta. This is the last contiguous temperate forest east of the Mississippi, and it's a globally significant forest. The CMP corridor would cause irreparable harm to hundreds of Maine's wetlands, waterways, and wildlife habitat areas. Segment 1 is home to the country's last stronghold of native brook trout, Maine State Heritage fish waters, critical deer wintering yards, and bird habitats. Major vernal pools and Maine's public lands would forever be damaged. Also, foreign corporations could make billions of dollars in profits. The CMP corridor will not help us in our continued fight to combat global climate change. Hydro-Quebec's flooding of First Nations people's land has caused a cultural genocide and pushed these communities into third world living conditions. Mainers should vote yes on one to reject this project so not to be complicit in this devastating treatment of Native communities. There's not been an environmental impact statement as was done with similar projects. And it's important for Mainers to know that the CMP corridor is not a done deal. There are federal and state permit appeals, CMP's invalidated public lands lease, pending court cases, ungranted municipal permits, and of course the upcoming referendum vote. Simply put, Mainers don't trust CMP, the worst rated utility in the nation for 3 consecutive years. Mainers have had enough of CMP's overbilling, poor customer service, and decades-long influence to stop true renewable expansion in Maine. The CMP corridor will not improve the existing infrastructure to bring power to your home. CMP will be obligated to restore power to Massachusetts ratepayers first, and then to Mainers. Maine will continue to be the blackout capital of the country, all while foreign shareholders reap the benefits. Over to you, Adam.
Thanks, Sandy. She got a lot in there. I will just add, my name is Adam Cote. I'm an attorney at Drummond Woodsum. I've spent the majority of my career working on renewable energy projects. I don't think that this CMP corridor will do anything to mitigate climate change. I think it's a terrible deal for Maine, and I don't think that Mainers should trust CMP to run what will effectively be one of the largest construction projects in state history. I also think that CMP has been on a concerted effort in the last several weeks to put out a lot of ads that are misleading and inaccurate to get Mainers confused. I'm hopeful that Mainers will see through that on November 2nd. And I'm looking forward to our discussion tonight. I want to thank the Bangor Daily News for hosting it, and I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you. And Adrian and Ben, your opening statements on behalf of No on One.
Great. Thank you, Susan, Joe, and the whole team at the Bangor Daily News for this opportunity. And Adrian has generously given me the full 5-minute opening. The choice before Maine voters is very clear. Do we want to lead on clean energy, creating hundreds of new jobs with significant new benefits for local communities? Or do we want to pass a far-reaching, dangerous, and retroactive law that was written by and for the oil and gas industry? That's the choice we'll be discussing tonight, and that's why voters should vote no on question 1. Achieving our ambitious clean energy goals by 2050 is the moonshot of our time, a monumental undertaking that's going to require all our ingenuity and perseverance. The payoff is a wave of innovation, good jobs, and a healthier future for Maine's environment, our children and grandchildren. Question 1, on the other hand, seeks to keep us stuck in the past, using the energy of the past. Question 1 is dangerous and far-reaching. First of all, I want to talk about the retroactivity. It reaches back as far as 2014 to change the results of decisions that were fairly made. And so it's a question of basic fairness, the basic fairness found on every playground in Maine. Do state permits, do lease decisions have the reliability that Maine businesses and individuals can rely on? And it's also a question of unintended consequences. There are other projects caught in the net of question 1. It's not tailored to fit just the clean energy corridor, but it also captures existing other projects and future projects, most notably the Northern Maine Renewable Energy Development Program that seeks to develop a high-powered corridor between Aroostook County and the rest of Maine, connecting it to New England. And question 1 prevents Maine from boldly seizing opportunity in the form of clean energy, a healthy environment, community benefits, and jobs. The clean energy corridor will reduce more than 3 million tons of carbon pollution every year. It will support 1,600 jobs during construction with the requirement that Maine workers be given preference. Right now, over 70% of the construction workers working on the project are Mainers. The project will expand broadband, bringing super high-speed connectivity to some of the most rural parts of Maine, benefiting businesses, schools, healthcare, and remote workers. It will bring aid to local governments. For example, the city of Lewiston is already saying, because of the new revenues brought in by virtue of the construction of the Clean Energy Corridor, they're both lowering property taxes and increasing city services. And also, remarkably, the project, on top of all those benefits, is going to put downward pressure on our energy bills as well. Question 1, on the other hand, offers none of these things. No new clean energy, no protection of Maine wildlife and ecosystems, no measurable economic benefit to anyone except the carbon polluters who wrote the question, the folks who have the most to lose when your energy bills go down. What I hope we're not going to hear too much more of tonight from question 1 supporters is their usual talking points that ignore the established facts. Let's be clear. The Clean Energy Corridor has been thoroughly studied, vetted, and approved by all the expert regulators. Question 1, meanwhile, was written behind closed doors by lobbyists. There was no opportunity for public comment or independent scrutiny of any kind. It's just a naked attempt by the oil and gas industry to take out the competition. In fact, they have raised millions to pass this bad referendum and halt clean energy projects. And the question we should ask ourselves tonight is why? Why are some of Maine's worst carbon polluters willing to go to such lengths to stop this project? And the answer is that if they defeat the Clean Energy Corridor, their industry gets to continue churning out carbon pollution and avoid billions of dollars in losses. So for our energy future, for our economic future, and for our energy security, we must vote no on question 1.
Thank you. You've all touched on a lot of issues that we hope we have time to get back to, but very quickly want to walk through the language of question 1 and talk about the 3 different parts of the question that voters will see. And Joe is going to share the referendum language for our audience to see. And the first part of the referendum question would ban high impact transmission lines in the upper Kennebec region. This would essentially stop the CMP corridor. And so Ben and Adrian, your groups have raised concerns, as you alluded to, Ben, that this could have implications going forward. Wonder if you can talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. And Susan, I'll take that if you don't mind. I would just like to say thank you to all of the viewers who are tuning in. Thank you to BDN, of course. We're here to give the facts. Both sides are, and we hope to make it better informed voters for people going to the polls on November 2nd. And so hopefully they can have, their say on this. But what is at the heart of this question is the retroactive language. And as much as we want to break this down, as Susan has put up on the screen, we've got—
Adrian, we are going to get to the retroactive language. I just want to point that out.
Okay, perfect. So we're just going over the first part right now?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so as much as we want to dissect this, and we will, we have to understand also that this is the proposed law. It's multiple pages long, as you can see, and we have to dig into the details. The devil is always in the details and in that fine print, but it goes, we have to talk about the retroactive laws. They're those that explicitly refer to and change the past legal consequences of past behavior. And this specific retroactive law in question 1 is to use legislation to go back in time and restrict the rights of law-abiding citizens and businesses. And it could very well have a chilling impact on business owners and property owners alike in our state. Now, whereas section 1 of this, there's no mention of retroactivity, there is in this proposed law, and it does obtain to this specific section.
And Sandi and Adam, can you tell us what high impact transmission lines are? What is the definition, and why should they be banned in the upper Kennebec region?
Susan, I'll take this one. So as defined in Maine statute, a high impact electrical transmission line is by 50 miles. That's already been established. And so, You know, the reason why I got involved in this 3 years ago is because we need to protect the Upper Kennebec region. This is an area that is absent of high impact transmission lines. Thousands of Mainers have come together because of the urgency protecting that we need to do to protect Western Maine and this contiguous forest, because it's a globally significant region. Mainers don't want this type of commercial exploitation in the Western mountains and rivers. And why do we want to preserve Western Maine and the Upper Kennebec region? We're focused on preserving wildlife habitat, including the last stronghold of native brook trout, habitat in the country, critical deer wintering yards, and migratory bird habitats, wetlands, vernal pools, waterways, including 2 Class AA quality rivers like the Kennebec and Dead Rivers, and Mate State Heritage Fish Waters. This is a special place with a strong history and tradition for many generations for outdoor recreation. It's a place where I've guided for decades and where I choose to reconnect with the natural world. It's a place where visitors travel to from all across the world to escape large-scale infrastructure. This is where Maine's iconic brand is rooted in its natural resources, and we don't want it to be irreparably harmed. So according to the John Muir Trust study in 2017, a majority of visitors to regions of undeveloped wildland said they would not return if this area would be developed. So we need to protect Western Maine from unnecessary development. If the CMP corridor goes through, it'll be the beginning of the end for what so many in Maine and those who love Maine hold dear. We don't want to needlessly ruin this globally significant habitat for a for-profit project when there are over 40 other options available that were submitted to Massachusetts to meet their power needs. Vermont already has a fully permitted project that would have fewer environmental impacts. It's ready to go. It's supported in Vermont and it was mitigated. So Maine doesn't have to bear the burden to needlessly tear up a 100-foot wide clear cut of 50 miles in this region. And lastly, Susan, the Maine State Federation of Firefighters issued a letter of concern about the CMP corridor because from the Quebec border down to Bingham, the first 70 miles of the line, there's no full-time fire and rescue support available. Should this direct current line cause a fire, like we saw so horribly in California, we simply don't have the support to protect the environment of Maine. So let's protect the Upper Kennebec region from commercial exploitation and get some yes votes in November. Thank you.
Sandy, I just want to clarify that this region is home to a lot of working forest and commercial forestry. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And, you know, I think for generations and decades, it has been a working forest and it's been managed well, and those forests grow back. If this corridor goes through, we're not going to have the allowed swath growing back. This will be a permanent alteration to this area, which we want to avoid.
Thank you. And moving on to the second part of the referendum question. This relates to a section of the Maine Constitution, which Joe will also put on the screen. And this provision requires 2/3 legislative approval for projects that will substantially alter the use of public lands that are held for conservation and recreation purposes. The Maine Bureau of Public Lands granted leases to CMP in 2014 and 2020 to use about 1 mile of public lot land near West Forks after it determined that the legislative approval requirement was not triggered. Recently, a Maine judge ruled that the Bureau's process was inadequate and has vacated the company's leases. The second part of the question, which you saw the language for, would go beyond the constitutional provision and require majority legislative approval for transmission lines and some other projects, including pipelines and railroads anywhere in Maine. And Adam, can you explain why the legislature should be included in these decisions, even in cases where they're not using public land?
Sure, I think you combine 2 and 3. If you want to pull it back up, I can kind of clarify what you said, Susan. I can go through and combine, do 2.
I'll pull that back up in a second, Adam. Adrian dropped off and she's working to get back on.
Okay.
I think you can go ahead, Adam, and we'll try and get that language back for you.
So do you want me to talk about the public lands, or do you want me to talk about the 50 miles? Because they're two separate and you kind of combined them. I could do either one you prefer, or one right after another. It's up to you.
I mean, the language of the second phrase says it would require the legislature to approve all other such projects anywhere in Maine, both retroactively to 2020. We'll get to the retroactive piece, but that is the second phrase in the question.
Yeah, so section 2, these such projects is referring to high impact electric transmission lines, which Sandi said these are essentially your large transmission corridors. These are 345 kV direct current, large transmission corridors. That's what this applies to. And they have to be, as Sandi said, over 50 miles. It does not include connections where you have a generation plant in Maine, for example, a solar farm or a wind farm or something. It doesn't include those. It doesn't include ones that are determined that we need for reliability purposes. So it essentially requires majority approval from the legislature for these types of large scale projects similar to the CMP corridor. So why do that? Because the legislature should be involved in these large projects of substance. In fact, we've had 3 other ones that have been large transmission projects that have actually gone over public lands in the last several years. In 2008, there was one by Bangor Hydro, another one by Bangor Hydro in 2010, and another one by TransCanada in 2008. They saw legislative approval because they went over public lands, and they received 2/3 vote. So for good projects, if you will, there shouldn't be any problem getting legislative approval to do these. And real quickly, Ben mentioned in his introduction as how this would affect something like the Northern Maine connection, which he mentioned. I was involved in working on that legislation, helping to write it. That's the perfect example of a project that is an excellent project that's needed for Maine and would very easily get legislative approval. For example, the bill that passed on it passed out of committee near unanimous and under the hammer for both the House and Senate. Under the hammer essentially means they didn't even, they consider it unanimous because it was such a good project. You juxtapose that with something like the CMP corridor, where CMP really tried to go behind the scenes and not seek legislative approval, particularly on the public lands, which I know we'll talk about next. And I'll save my discussion on the public lands for that piece. But that's the majority approval for over 50 miles, massive corridor type projects.
And Ben and Adrian, you have raised concerns that this provision would make it more difficult to get approval for projects, including clean energy projects in Maine. Wonder if you can explain those concerns a little more deeply.
Yeah, and Susan, I apologize. My computer was having some technical difficulty, but I will say I caught the majority of what Ms. Howard said, and what she was saying about the contiguous forest and it being pristine. In fact, the project we're talking about here, the hydropower project corridor, it's along 2/3 of existing transmission lines, and 1/3 of it is along a working commercial forest. So we have to keep that in mind. But going to the legislative approval angle that Adam Cote was just talking about, the legislative approvals that Mr. Cote speaks of were easements granted by the Bureau of Parks and Lands. I believe he mentioned Bangor Hydro, TransCanada. Those were not leases, those were easements. And BPL correctly understands the law requiring legislative approval of easements, which are a permanent grant of rights of public reserve lands. But BPL has never obtained legislative approval for a lease of public land because the law does not require such approval, since the legislature, in very statute that Section 1 of the referendum seeks to amend, it gives BPL the authority, the explicit authority to enter 25-year leases for electric and or telecommunications lines and facilities, pipelines, and of the like. So this has been the agency's consistent interpretation for over 25 years, and it was never objected to by members of the legislature before this specific project. And we have to look at the funding of who is supporting this ballot question, why it's so complicated and convoluted. And it's big oil and the gas industry from out of state who have paid for this in their competition to the hydropower corridor. So they're in direct competition. They've put this referendum up to kill off and eliminate their competition so that they can keep their profits. I mean, that's really what this comes down to. And if we can get into it further, I know we will as we move on, the lease issue is going to affect not only this project, but also 355 other leases. And those are projects, those are leases that are owned by camp owners and private property owners. So there are unintended consequences with this.
If I may, I think Adam may have referenced it, but I think one of the implications is that CMP chose to go the lease route versus the easement route, perhaps because it was viewed as an easier route to go. And I would also point out that, yes, there are concerns about impacts on other projects, but news reports have indicated that there may be 2 or so projects that would be affected by this language, not hundreds. I'm sorry, we don't have a lot of time, so we're going to move on to the third part of the question.
I have something very important to say about the legislative piece of this. Adam brushes it off like it's going to be a fait accompli, but what's happening here is empowering the legislature to usurp the authority of the Public Utilities Commission and the Department of Environmental Protection. That's really dangerous. The legislature itself established both of these agencies for the precise purpose, for the exact purpose to remove the decision-making from the political arena, because they know that the legislature, the legislative environment is fraught. There's no way to hold the legislature to a system of accountability. There's no way to prohibit legislators from trading votes on unrelated matters. There's no way to prohibit legislators from meeting in private with interested parties. There's no prohibition on legislators taking campaign contributions from interested parties. There's potentially no right of appeal. This is dangerous. It's going to be pretty difficult for us to achieve our clean energy goals if these are the rules.
I would just add, Ben, that I'm sorry, that usurp is a very strong word. I think it's fair to say it adds another layer of review, but I'm not sure that it takes away the authority of the other agencies that would continue to review these projects.
No, Susan, I have to disagree with you. It gives the legislature veto power over PUC decisions. That's usurpation.
Ben, this referendum doesn't give any special powers to the legislature. The Maine Constitution, which I know we're going to be talking about later, empowers the legislature with a special responsibility over our public lands. The argument that Adrian just made about the leases versus the easements is the exact same argument CMP made before a sitting judge, which was soundly rejected. The CMP, these past projects that I mentioned, a couple of them are virtually identical to the CMP corridor. When Adrian said that they properly recognized that requires legislative approval, that she's correct, they did. And CMP looked at it and said, well, we don't want to go to the legislature for approval, so let's not call it an easement, we'll call it a lease. And that's what the judge called them out on. And that's what this referendum is calling CMP out on. And when Adrian says, and when you guys keep running these commercials of unintended consequences, you start out saying it was a deck, and now she's talking about hundreds of leases and all of these things. 297 of them were for camps. They would not even remotely apply to this. They've now filtered it down to 2, and those 2 that you guys keep shopping around, in fact, those leases, the original leases for those were entered into even before the constitutional amendment happened. It's ridiculous. They wouldn't even come close to applying. So when we say that retroactively it will be the CMP corridor that will be affected. The reason for that is that we're not targeting a business and boohoo and they're a victim. The reality is they're the only ones that broke the requirement before. We're clarifying what the Constitution already says. This isn't empowering politicians. This is empowering people, because the Constitution gave the legislature that special power over the public lands. CMP tried to go around that.
In the
But
legislature,
Adam, to clarify, this referendum would involve the legislature in approval of of transmission lines that are not on public lands. That is a new provision. That is not something that is already in the state constitution. So that's a new requirement, and that's a new involvement of the legislature.
You are correct. You are
Okay,
correct.
let's move on to the third part of the question, which is a reiteration, but I would suggest also an expansion of the protection of public lands. Because I'm sorry, I just lost my train of thought and I apologize for that. But I know you guys really wanted to talk about the retroactivity, and that comes into play, particularly in this question. So I'm wondering, Adam and Sandy, if you can talk about why it retroactively goes back to 2014 to have this approval on all public lands. And that's what I was going to say before. The Constitution talks about public lands that are managed for conservation and recreation. And I believe that this language would make it apply to all public lands. But let's focus on the retroactivity piece, please.
Do you want me to take it, Sandy?
Go ahead and take that.
Okay. It goes back to 2014 because that's when CMP originally entered into the lease over the public lands. They, as I said, they called it a lease rather than an easement because they didn't want to trigger the constitutional requirement. So all we're doing by putting this referendum in there and having it apply to 2014 is to clarify that that lease that was signed by CMP in 2014 triggered that constitutional requirement, which, as I said, we have argued and the judge agreed recently, always existed. It was just they tried to word it differently so they could be cute and get around it. So when I make comments that it's only going to retroactively affect the CMP corridor, and then CMP says it has all sorts of unintended consequences, I'd be happy to have that discussion next because I feel very confident that it won't. When we talk about retroactive laws and CMP saying this is giving new powers to politicians, politicians have always had the power to pass retroactive laws. They've passed 184 of them since 2001. When Ben was in the legislature, he voted for a bunch of them. And this is not uncommon. You would have people believe, if you watch CMP's commercials, that this is a new transformative event that's happening. It isn't. They've been able to do this lots of times. They recently did it for net energy billing with solar laws. CMP didn't have a problem with that because they didn't want to interconnect Maine solar projects locally, so that there's no issue there. But here, where they're essentially being called out for doing it the wrong way, all of a sudden they're saying there's a problem with it now.
So I would like to comment now, if I may. You know, the Mainers who I'm talking to who are voting no on question 1 understand the Maine Constitution, specifically Article 1, Section 11. The legislature shall pass no ex post facto law. The U.S. Constitution has a similar prohibition, and that's what is at the heart of this debate. There are unintended consequences for businesses down the line because this hydropower corridor, it has already received every permit, every grant of approval, all the way through. I mean, we can go through the list. It's exhaustive. The Maine Public Utilities Commission, the U.S. Department of Energy, the Maine Department of Environmental Protection, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, among others. And what we're doing here is essentially saying that we are going to invite people to come invest in Maine, bring their businesses here and spend their money here in capital. But at some point down the road, the government or some politician or a legislature can revoke, rescind, take away that permit for no wrongdoing of their own. And that's simply wrong. It's unfair. And it's not playing by the rules of our Constitution. And to say that retroactive laws are fine, it's just a perfectly way to govern, it's not. We should be looking prospectively at our laws. This retroactive law is an underhanded way for out-of-state oil and gas companies to avoid playing by the rules. They wrote the question. Lawyers and lobbyists for NextEra and Calpine, they helped to write this, and it's going to put more money in their pockets and less money in hardworking Mainers' pockets. Even the Maine State Chamber of Commerce, which represents thousands of Maine businesses, both big and small, they support a no vote on this question because they understand the devastating effect that it could potentially have on bringing more business into Maine. You know, we all know how to play by the rules, but if in the future somebody can change it just because they have competition and they don't like them, well, you know, it's going to be really tough to bring more investments to Maine.
I'm now going to turn it over to my colleague, Matt Yunker, who is the assistant editorial page editor at the Bangor Daily News. We have a lot of questions that we received from our survey before the event, and we also have a lot of audience questions, and we're now going to try and move through those as quickly as we can.
Thank you, Susan. And thank you to everyone who submitted questions through both the survey and through the Q&A here in Zoom. Unfortunately, I'm not sure we're going to be able to get to all of them, but we're going to do our best. And we have identified some consistent themes. For example, many, particularly in the survey, many folks were seeking clarity on the funding behind question one campaigns. So I'd like to now ask each participant to explain as directly as possible who your major funders are and what their interests are in this campaign. And I'd also ask secondarily that everyone's answering this question for themselves rather than getting into back and forth based on other people's answers. So I think maybe we'll start with Adrian on that one.
Okay. Well, I am the spokesperson for Mainers for Fair Laws, which is funded by Clean Energy Matters, which is a political action committee. It's founded by Avangrid and the NECEC, which is New England Clean Energy Connect Transmission LLC, both of which support the project. And we've been very honest and transparent about the funding. And, you know, the other side, I can't say that they've been as clear. And the supporters of question one, they're primarily, as I've mentioned before, big oil and gas companies. And I know Adam will be very honest that he is an attorney and his clients are NextEra and Energy and Calpine, two companies that are in direct competition with the corridor. And NextEra stands to save $1 to $3 million every day that this corridor project is delayed. And that differential in $1 to $3 million is because of the energy market, that the prices go to auction every day, but it's in upwards $1 to $3 million every day. And if you follow the money, big oil and gas has funded.
Reminder here, please only answer for yourself so we can keep passing the baton around as we're in the second half of the hour.
Okay.
Who's next, Matt?
Ben,
Okay,
turn it
Matt,
over to you.
your connection's a little shaky there, Matt. I represent Mainers for Clean Energy Jobs. We're a newly formed political action committee, and we're funded by the Maine State Chamber of Commerce and the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, Local 104. And I want to be fully transparent. For the last 3 years, until we sort of entered into this campaign period, Mainers for Clean Energy Jobs and my work was funded by the Maine State Chamber of Commerce solely, and the Maine State Chamber of the Central Maine Power is a member of the Maine State Chamber of Commerce and supports the Chamber's work.
All right, now over to Adam and Sandy, and I apologize to everyone if you're having any trouble hearing me from my internet connection.
Thanks, Matt. I could hear you that time. Just to be clear, I'm the only panelist here who's not being paid. I'm a volunteer. And 2 years ago, our grassroots organization, Say No to NECEC, formed a political action committee because we were engaging in the referendum process. And all of those PAC filings are in with Maine Ethics. I invite any of you to look at all of the PACs here. So we are primarily funded. The most number of donations we've received this year, 430 small dollar donations to the tune of about $30 each from citizen grassroots activists. Unfortunately, none of the other PACs have that ability to claim that. We also have had some major donations by National Environmental Organization Food and Water Watch, and we do receive funding from a coalition partner, Mainers for Local Power.
So I'll pick up
Power.
there.
And Sandy, who funds Mainers for Local Power?
Yes, as you would see in the PAC filings, those contributors are Nextera, Calpine, and Vistra.
Thank you. Now over to Adam, if you can still hear me.
I can hear you good enough, Matt. So yes, Adrian sort of answered my question for me, but let me fill in the other details. Yes, Calpine, Vistra, and Nextera are the primary funders of Mainers for Local Power. They've been paying the majority of the bills on the legal side, but we've also represented everyone from Sandy's side, which is the volunteers, the major environmental groups in the state of Maine, legislators that are both Democrats and Republicans and independents, Maine guides, outfitters, folks that are landowners up there. We've had a broad coalition of folks that are opposed to this. Now, and first of all, I'll also add, Adrian mentioned Avangrid, who also owns fossil fuels. So, you know, when you get to these large energy companies, they own all sorts of things. What they don't say about Nextera is they also own more wind and solar power in the country than anybody else. There's a lot of that in the energy industry. So yes, we represent some that are competitors that are opposed to the project. I would tell you that they weren't involved at all in writing. They've been involved in the bill or any of this other stuff. They've written checks, absolutely. And without that, we wouldn't have been able to we wouldn't be able to be here today. But I feel very convinced that the volunteers, the 80,000 that signed the petitions, we actually had 100,000 signatures, but we had a hard time getting them all notarized in time. This is a massive volunteer effort. And this is going to be reflected, I believe, in the election on November 2nd. And I will say that while we are being outspent 5-1 by really two sources, that's Hydro-Quebec and Avangrid, which is also CMP. So yeah, we're getting some funding from their competitors, but the work is being done by us. So I mean, people can take that for however they want.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Adam. I thought you were finished, but that's very misleading. You know, your clients, Nextera, Vistra, Calpine, spent $1.5 million on the signature collection to qualify this question for the ballot. You know, you can't say we spent $1.5 million on petition circulation and say it was largely a volunteer effort.
It was largely volunteer. That's insulting. Go ahead, Sandy. Go ahead. What you guys did.
It's amazing. As we know,
Sandy, I think you have something to say. And Sandy, if you could just say something, then we're going to move on to another question because we're getting into the back and forth category now on this, and everybody has answered. So once you've finished here, let's move on to another question.
Thank you, Matt. I appreciate that. What I just wanted to point out is throughout the history of citizens referendums in Maine, it's common to have paid collectors, paid circulators. What's not common is to have over 400 volunteer collectors standing outside in Maine's cold winter during a global pandemic and bringing in more signatures than we needed by a long shot. So, you know, for those of you who are listening today who volunteered to collect signatures and over 80,000 Mainers signed of their free will, I just want to tell you how much I appreciate you.
Thank you all for answering that question. Hopefully you can hear me okay. We've also heard a lot from folks, both audience members and in the survey, who are trying to better understand the environmental and economic consequences of this question. So I want to ask each of you, and some of this has been touched on already, but ask directly, from your perspective, what are both the economic and environmental implications of this referendum question? And so Sandi and Adam, I'm going to turn it to you first.
Adam, why don't you take that part?
Sure, I'll take the environmental. Ben talks a lot about how it reduces greenhouse gas emissions. He cites the 3 million tons that greenhouse gas that CMP submitted in their application to the PUC. He ignores the fact that he and other lobbyists for CMP tried to defeat a bill by Brownie Carson, who's a state senator and used to be head of the Natural Resources Council of Maine, to do an actual study of greenhouse gas emissions. Very similar project in New Hampshire. They did a study and they determined there wasn't any. And here's why. When we talk about climate change, okay, climate change, by definition, that affects everybody in the climate. When you are taking power that's already being generated in Canada and you put it down here, that's not new generation. It's just Canada selling it to somebody who's going to pay them more money for it. It's using us for an extension cord. That's really what's happening here. When it comes to the environmental degradation, Sandi talked about that. But I will also leave it with this point when we talk about the benefits and those things, because this is a big topic, and I know it's one Ben has talked about quite a bit. If he is convinced, or folks are actually convinced, that this power from Canada will help mitigate climate change, there's a much better project that is shovel ready coming out of Vermont that will actually be underground, that won't have the wildfire problems. It won't have the ice storm problems that this one would have from the CMP corridor going through a critical environment. And much more importantly, they don't want to do that because they offered 900 million to Vermont, which Massachusetts doesn't want to pay. They offered 500 million to New Hampshire, which New Hampshire said it's still not a good deal. We're not going to do it. We get offered 250 million, and a bunch of the benefits all involve people using more electricity, which surprising CMP would want that. So, you know, that's my summation of climate change and benefits in a nutshell.
So I'd like to take a swing at this. The Public Utilities Commission spent 18 months reviewing this project, and that review included analysis of climate impacts. After that 18 months of review, in which these very questions were put before the commission, and they were answered by the commission's independent and professional analysts, and reported to all the interested parties, including all of Adam Cote's clients, the fact that this is new clean energy, that there is capacity in Quebec that's not being delivered to markets already. It's just sitting there. In fact, there's so much of it that in recent years, they've had to spill water over the dams without generating power because they don't have a way to deliver it to markets. That's where a transmission line comes in. So the PUC independently determined that there is excess capacity here and that delivering it into the New England region would lower, not just lower electricity prices in Maine and across New England, but also reduce climate emissions. And that analysis was supported by another piece of analysis done on behalf of the US Department of Energy. It's beyond question. It's been answered by the experts, by the relative experts who have the power to investigate these things on our behalf and determine that this is clean energy that will lower climate emissions. Now, Adam admitted as much, and as did Sandi in her opening statement when they advocate for the Vermont project. The Vermont project, guess where it gets its energy from? Exactly the same source as the clean energy corridor. It's exactly the same energy. Delivering it through Vermont, delivering it through Maine, they will both have the positive climate impacts, and they've tacitly admitted that. Now, you know, what hasn't been talked about and is fascinating really is that we have a long way to go to achieve our carbon reduction goals. As was reported in the BDN this morning, that this one project is not enough. We need to do this and more. At the end of the day, we need the clean energy corridor, and we need Vermont too. Vermont's a good project. We should build it. We need both of them, not just one. And the net result is an enormous economic advantage to New England and to Quebec for that matter.
So what Ben's leaving out here, though, is that the PUC, they only investigated regional benefits for reducing greenhouse gas. It was not a global issue. So there's room for more of that. And why don't we know more? It's because Hydro-Quebec refused to submit their data and testify under oath at the approval agencies. In addition, CMP spent more money to bring an army of lobbyists into Augusta in 2019 to kill LD 640, which would have required an independent climate analysis on the CMP corridor. Had they allowed that to go through, I wonder what they were afraid of. And finally, at the federal level, we have to remember that both federal permits are under appeal right now by our environmental partners at Sierra Club, Natural Resources Council, and the Appalachian Mountain Club. There's been no environmental impact statement conducted on this project. It was conducted for similar projects with the same power source, Ben, for Northern Pass and the Vermont project, but this has not been conducted. So again, I want to remind Mainers that the CMP corridor is not a done deal until we vote yes to reject it in November.
I guess I want to say this about the federal appeals. They've actually had preliminary proceedings regarding those federal appeals, and both the district court here in Maine and the First Circuit Court of Appeals in Boston indicated by their rulings allowing the project construction to move forward that they didn't think the appellants had a likelihood of success on the merits of the case. If Sandi and Adam had faith in their federal appeals, they wouldn't be so concerned about question one. They wouldn't need question one at all. The fact is, the project saw incredibly thorough review from multiple layers of regulatory bodies, as Adrian expressed, and all of them approved it. And I have to say this about the bill that Sandi references, LD 640. I participated in that process, and I'll never forget the work session where the consultants that the committee brought in to ask, how would this sort of study work? And the consultant said, given the amount of money you've set aside and given the time you've set aside, about 60 days for the study, I can tell you this study can be cheap, it can be quick, it can be good. Pick any two, because it can't be all three. It was a flawed bill and it was rejected, never passed in the House or Senate for approval by the governor.
If I can add something going back to the initial question about jobs itself, and benefits of this project. I've been out talking with groups of, 10, 12, 50, 100 people at a time. And I'm noticing in some of the comments that are coming through, people are still confused about this and they're not understanding it. I think we're getting into a lot of the weeds. And when you get back to the question and the actual, benefits, as I mentioned, benefits first, there's already tax relief that is flowing into communities, including Lewiston, where 2.7 million in property tax relief has been distributed. 4.5 million will be distributed overall there. And these are also property tax benefits that are going to places along the corridor, Starks, Jay, Industry, West Forks, areas where Ms. Howard is from. You would think that you would want that property tax relief that's desperately needed. And there's also broadband support to the tune of $15 million. And so what is happening along this corridor is that splice boxes are being put up so there can be connectivity to these small towns and communities that don't have that ability yet. So those are just a few of the benefits in that $258 million deal. Maine taxpayers are not paying one dime for this corridor, yet we are getting $58 million in benefits, and $140 million of that is going toward CMP rate relief as well. But the broader picture here and getting back to the question is the far-reaching effects that it is going to have on businesses that want to continue to invest in Maine, create jobs, and those that we're looking to attract to come to Maine. If we're simply saying to them that we're going to yank your permit away from you after you've gone through every regulatory process, permitting, licensing, and grant, approval, and you've done everything lawfully and successfully, yet we can take that away from you at any time. Who do you think is going to want to invest in Maine? Not too many people that I can think of. Many business owners are afraid of this, and it's not a fear tactic. It's a direct result of the retroactive language that's included in this question.
I could very quickly wrap up some of the rebuttals that Adrian went through. The first is that summation of benefits to Maine. The Bangor Daily News summarize that as 7 cents per Mainer per month. And if you think you'll ever see that, then just read the news, and CMP's already talking about raising their rates already. So that will be gone. The other benefits they're talking about for a lot of these local communities, well, it's the local communities that primarily been opposed to it. Just about all of them have voted this as a terrible idea the more that they learned about it. Next, some of the other benefits are for heat pumps or for EV vehicles, which I think are great, but it doesn't surprise me CMP supports those because that leads you to create more electricity, which makes more revenue for them. I have seen CMP over the years, that LD 640 that Ben mentioned, I have seen CMP repeatedly try to kill any clean energy legislation that goes through the state of Maine because it doesn't make them money. The only ones that they support are the ones that make them money. And when Adrian talks about them being attacked as a victim, the only reason this is happening is primarily 2 reasons. First, the legislature was going to do a lot of this on their own. They had to adjourn because of COVID. They were working a lot of these bills through the legislature already. Secondly, there wouldn't be the sort of hook, if you will, that this referendum allows to come in if they hadn't already violated the Maine Constitution and were called out on it by a judge. That's really what makes a lot of this possible, if you will, to be effective on CMP. It's not because they did everything legally. It's quite the opposite. It's because they didn't do it legally, and it clarifies it under the law that you can't sort of run a sleight of hand and get away with it.
I'm going to jump in here because we're running out of time, and I would just point out the judge didn't rule that there was a violation of the Constitution, and it wouldn't be by CMP anyway. It would be by the Bureau of Public Lands, which granted the lease. We've had a lot of accusations back and forth. I hope we can end on a slightly more positive note. Several audience members have wondered, is there any middle ground here? Would there be a way to allow a corridor like CMP's to bring more clean energy into Maine while also protecting the environment of the Upper Kennebec region and other places where people are concerned about protecting wildlife and scenic vistas and things of those sort? And we're going to start with Ben and Adrian very quickly, and then we'll end with Adam and Sandi.
Thank you for the question. I just want to observe that all along the process, Essential Maine Power has demonstrated a willingness to find compromise and to make concessions. And in some cases, they were required to do that by the PUC and the DEP by the very strict conditions that existed in their permitting orders. But just a few examples. Beatty Pond, which is in Western Maine, wanted to protect views from sightlines from Beatty Pond. So there was a rerouting near Beatty Pond. CMP unilaterally offered not to spray pesticides, any pesticides on the segment of the corridor that's brand new corridor. The DEP required that the corridor clearing be narrowed to a 54-foot wide clearing instead of the full 150-foot wide right-of-way. They required tapering of the vegetation so that more vegetation could be preserved along the corridor, and travel zones for wildlife could exist along the corridor. They required buffer zones around wetlands. They required, this is particularly exciting to me, and I have to give a huge shout out to the Nature Conservancy and the Maine Audubon Society, who worked through the process to see that in exchange for the 1,000 acres of project footprint, that that 40,000 acres of conservation land would be set aside. And so there's a 40-to-1 conservation land to project footprint benefit from the building of the clean energy corridor, permanent conservation. And there are also elements like trout stream culvert improvements. These are existing culverts that have deteriorated that CMP will now pay to repair, leaving a better environment for trout in the area. Those are just some examples of the many positive concessions that were made along the way of approving this project.
And Adam and Sandy, is there a middle ground?
Sure. Sandy just said, why don't you take it? She sent me a text. Yeah, I mean, I work in this space. I honestly, when I talk about there being a broad coalition opposed to the CMP corridor, I mean it. And it's not NIMBYism. There isn't a, gee, we don't like development where it's sort of, knuckle draggers, walking around, mouth breathers, whatever you want to call the lack of progress crowd. That isn't what's happening. It's a few different things that sort of brings people together. The first is this is a terrible spot to do it. Second, it's a terrible deal for Maine because we're essentially an extension cord for Massachusetts with low benefits that were already rejected by another state. And third, people just don't trust CMP because they haven't really demonstrated that they can do little things well, and people don't really trust them to run a massive project. I mean, I've been in all sorts of these meetings behind the scenes, obviously, with this broad coalition. I'll tell you that people typically fall into one, usually all three of the camps. So I'm bullish on the future of Maine for renewable energy, for the possibility of project development and collaboration. I hope CMP can turn things around. It's just one thing after another with them. They haven't demonstrated any propensity to be able to handle something like this, particularly when they give testimony that says, if there's a problem with that line, we've got to handle that first before we deal with Mainers outages. I mean, we're dealing with outages already. How are we going to, deal with that? That just doesn't go over well with people. And I think it shouldn't, because they haven't demonstrated that level of trust. But I think in the future, I'm very positive that we can do the projects that we need to do to support clean energy, climate initiatives, and job creation, all those sorts of things. And I do not believe if this referendum is passed that it would create a prohibitive barrier for any of that to happen.
Our time has gone very quickly. Again, I want to thank all of our participants for joining us tonight and for all of our audience members. And I'm going to turn it back over to Joe.
Thanks, Susan. And thank you to our panelists, to Susan and Matt, and to all of you for sharing your questions in advance and during the forum. Don't forget to vote on or before November 2nd, and keep an eye on the Bangor Daily News for answers to your questions that we weren't able to get to in tonight's discussion. It is a lengthy list, and you've given our reporters a lot to chew on. I know that they'll be pouring through the chat transcript and the Q&A transcript, so thank you for contributing to both. We also encourage you to send a letter to the editor on this issue if you are so moved. Please keep in mind that the cutoff for election-related opinions is Monday, October 25th. Send your letter to letters@bangordailynews.com. Watch your inbox over the next couple of days for an event recap email from us. This will include a link to the video of this evening's discussion and a promo code that you can use for a discounted BDN subscription, digital BDN subscription. So thank you again and have a great night.